paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryan Podcast. Today, my guest is therapist Katie Keech. How you doing today, Katie?
I'm doing pretty well. How about yourself?
Good. I met Katie on a listserv for ritual abuse mind control. And although I'm not a clinician, nor have I played a clinician on television, I ended up on that group. And it's actually a very interesting, fascinating group. And could you give us a little history about yourself, Katie?
Sure. I guess I could skip around. I started working as a clinician. Well, actually, I started working with mental health in 1999, 2000, where I started being a manager at sort of a middle manager at San Francisco Suicide Prevention, and I helped launch the Trevor Project there, which was quite a thing.
And Trevor,
Do you know the Trevor Project is a phone line? It's a helpline for youth who are questioning if they're queer or LGBT in any context, and who are coming out, and usually for younger folks. So there wasn't anything like that at that time. And it was hard to launch because some of the people in SF Suicide Prevention weren't exactly so keen on answering phone lines for gay youth. So I kind of had to get people a little more comfortable with the concept, they're in crisis. You talk to people in crisis. You want them to feel okay about themselves. So we're just here to help people. And then I have worked with trafficked youth quite a bit. Different programs with what they call it, and I hate the term, serious mental illness, SMI. So I've managed a couple of programs with serious mental illness, mostly young adults, and I've done managed briefly a forensics program, and that was just kind of all ages. And now I do private practice, but I do a lot of trainings and things like that on different concepts and things people want to know about trauma. Yeah.
and you work a lot with neurodivergence. Could you tell the audience?
Sure. So
Divergence?
neurodiversity is like all of us. It's like everybody included, all people's brains, nervous systems are neurodiverse. But neurodivergence is when you take something that's supposed to be from the norm and you diverge from it. So a lot of different things can plug into that. And I primarily have worked with autism and ADHD. DID is also considered a neurodivergence because the brain is mapped differently. The system works differently than what's called neurotypical. So TBIs, things that can be acquired later in life. These are all divergencies from what's typical, and I found it really interesting. I like to kind of look into nuance, and I like to look at where things get kind of complicated. So I just started to have more clients with different divergencies, or what you would call multiply neurodivergent. That's when you might have a TBI and are autistic and have DID, and wanted to figure out how to be more specifically helpful for those folks. And in starting to do that, I had a person I went to high school with who's become a specialist in specifically autism and ADHD. And he's like, I think, Katie, I think you're autistic. And I was like, I don't think so. And he's like, take these tests. I took the test going I'm totally gonna score in and I didn't.
Well, I had a friend tell me we were having an argument, and she yelled at me, "You're on the spectrum." She said a number of things that were even worse than that, but
It's not actually bad. I mean, it's just a different way to function. It's actually has a lot of uses. Like there's pattern recognition that's phenomenal. A lot of us are really empathetic and connect really well with each other, and notice sort of little minute details. It's just a different operating system. So
Autism is kind of fascinating. I've Ghost wrote a book on autism some years ago.
Really?
Yeah. And why do you think there's such an exponential explosion of autism in our society?
Well, currently, I think that it's always been there. Like we only really discovered that autism we only put names to it around the 30s, and that's why people don't like the term Asperger's anymore because that was actually a Nazi. Hans Asperger developed the concept for identifying autistic youth, and those were the first test subjects for individuals who were killed basically for not fitting in. And then that program was then expanded from there. So that's where it started. And you can kind of read about that if you want in Neurotribes. That's a book that kind of goes over the history. But it's all like in Neurotribes, like, it talks about how it's always been part of humanity. It's always been there. It's kind of like DID. Like if you don't know how to look for it, you're not going to see it. And so we've only really looked at it and identified it when it's become a problem for that person to kind of manage in the world. But a lot of us kind of just mask and fake it. So we don't get identified. So it seemed to get a little bit bigger more recently during the pandemic. A lot of the testing and a lot of the research has been they looked at cis white males. And that was the core of what was studied. And so then people who were black or brown or women, whatever, they got missed because it doesn't present as different as the same. So like stimming can look very differently. You're not going to necessarily look at like trains. You're going to be looking at special interests like animals or My Little Pony, or something. It's not what is in the literature. And so yeah, so back to the pandemic, people just started looking at themselves more because they were holed up in their home and they were terrified, and they were looking at different kinds of things on the internet and trying to figure things out, probably trying to calm themselves down. And so people just started to go, oh, actually, this fits, and this is why I've always felt a little bit weird. And then people have been starting to get testing and ask for testing, and that's, I think, why it's gotten to be so big as it is.
What's interesting in the book that I wrote, I came across something that was fascinating. The Amish don't seem to have autism.
I
And
saw something about that, but they actually do. It's just not labeled. But there is some ex-Amish people who say yes, definitely there are autistic Amish people.
because I was wondering, is there something in the modern world? Because is it that something in this world that we haven't quite adjusted to that makes
Uh,
us autism?
I don't think so, because I think we've always had autistic people. I just don't think it hasn't been labeled. It's just been like I think there's a concept that people have talked about, and there's no research, and we can't go back in time and do research, but there is a concept that the concept of changeling was actually about autistic kids. Um, they were fine, and then suddenly, because autism, you don't have pruning in the same way that neurotypical people do. So the brain just kind of has a moment where it's working like you would expect a neurotypical kid to work, and then it just doesn't for some whatever reason. And so that fits with the myth of changelings. Like they thought, oh, I have this kid, and this kid is normal, and suddenly they change my kid out, and now my kid is a different kid. I don't know if you're familiar with the whole fairy lore and mythology and concept of changelings.
A little bit. So we're back to neurodiversity. What is the most common neurodiversity that you run into as a therapist?
Well, that's hard to. Well, actually, that's not hard to explain. Actually, I have most of my clients at this point are both OSDD or DID and also autistic. And then there might be ADHD in there as well. I have some clients who are just ADHD and don't have DID, but primarily the most common client I seem to work with is autistic and ADHD. And I have some TBI, traumatic brain injury, in there as well. Um, and I think it's because uh, there's a whole thing called the double empathy problem. I don't know if you've heard about that. That's more recent autistic research.
If you could explain
Yeah,
it.
I would totally be happy to explain it. So it used to be thought that autistic people were non-empathetic and couldn't do theory of mind. That's since been shown that like both people who aren't autistic and people who are autistic are equally capable of not having theory of mind that's not specific to autistic populations. Um, but what is found is like when you do a game of telephone, if you have there's a term allistic, and that simply means not autistic. That's just that term for that. Um, if you have a bunch of allistic people doing telephone with each other, they'll get the message and do it correctly and be able to mirror each other well. And it turns out if you get a bunch of autistic people together and you do the same thing, they function and it operates as equally as well among autistic people. Where it breaks down is if you mix autistic and allistic people, and then they're not, then the telephone breaks down. It doesn't work. Um, so my clients often have complained that they haven't been able to connect with therapists, or they felt like the therapists are fighting them, or there's just not that click, and it's just been easier with me. And I've definitely had clients like what do you call that, clock me, that term, like when they can tell, so they ask like, are you autistic, because I am really comfortable with you and I feel really easy to talk to you about things. And so then I have to disclose like I'm not officially diagnosed, but I've had the thing I explained earlier with you. And they're like, yeah, that checks, and then we just go on.
So, if someone has a traumatic brain injury,
Hmm.
OCD, and autism, how?
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a jumble. How do you go about treating a person like that?
Yeah, no, it's I take my time, but like with DID, you have to take your time. And I often work with complicated presentations. I just seem to put everything on the table as like this can happen, this can happen, this can happen, this can happen, and it could be related to this, or it could be related to that, or it could be related to the middle. And I don't snap to a pathway at first. I want to make sure I know what's happening, and sometimes it's a blend. Like sometimes they bounce off of each other. And so like with folks I have with TBIs and fibromyalgia and DID and autism, I'm looking at where they're sort of responding and what feels different over time. Like sometimes they're like, I felt like this, and then after the TBI, things shifted to this. um some of them actually found their systems through having a traumatic experience that caused a TBI. But we still have to go a lot slower. um so I'm sort of looking at where they're foggy, where it's hard for them to concentrate, that doesn't quite look like dissociation, it doesn't show up like dissociation. And then I'll also look at things like with autism and trauma, there's both sensory issues because the nervous system's kind of popped up. So you can't say sensory issues are specifically autism, and you can't say they're specifically DID. But what I've learned, and this might be kind of veering off, and I might be going on a tangent, so you can reel me back if I am, is that a lot of clinicians who work with DID will recognize that sensory issues are part of trauma and DID, but they don't zero in on it and they don't ask about it, and they expect the client to just be like, I have sensory issues. These are the things. So what I do, and I've learned, I've been kind of mixing autistic treatment models with my DID who maybe don't even have it, and it's been kind of huge because I'll just go in and say like, how do you eat? What are the sensory issues you have? What are things with clothes? What are things with lights? What are things with sound? Because they all have them, and then dialing those things down and asking them about it. Like you can dial it down by putting in certain comfortable earplugs, helping them take it seriously, and that will kind of dial down some of the traumatic impacts they experience day to day, whether they're autistic or not. but But if they're autistic, you know, then you're kind of looking at the childhood stuff. There's usually some traumatic impacts they've experienced because of their autism, the family or the community wasn't equipped to deal with. And then added more trauma on top of that. Like some of my autistic clients would just get overwhelmed and have meltdowns because not because they're doing a temper tantrum, but it looks like a temper tantrum, but they're just like the lights and the sound and the smells, and they would explode. And what would happen a lot of times, like some of my clients, the schools would lock them in a closet for a couple hours. Like, that's not legal, but that's what happened. Or some of my clients, their mom would just like sit on them and hold them down, and it was kind of violent and aggressive. So there's different traumas that seem to happen when somebody doesn't understand neurotype and how neurotype works and how it will just fire off. And that's why DID is actually a little higher in autistic communities than non-autistic communities.
And let's get into trauma and DID. That seems to be where your passion is, where your focus.
Mhm.
How did you originally get into that, treating trauma and DID?
That's Oh, okay. I used to like lie about that because but now I don't anymore because I'm pretty much out. I was an artist. A life sculptor was my main thing I used to do, and then I wielded my way with somebody in Berkeley, Wendy Sussman, who does expressionist portraiture. She pushed me into painting, and I was doing a lot of that. But I at that point got I failed statistics. I got in to do study art, and then I failed statistics, and I was in on that like kind of a temporary transfer, and so I got kicked out of Berkeley, which was really devastating because I really did not want to move back home, which was in Southern California. And so as a result, I started hanging out in comic shops and bookstores and things like that. And I found this comic called Cuckoo, and it's about a young woman who has DID, and she talks about it, and she sort of explores what it feels like in a very realistic, non-dramatic way. And that was the first time that I had heard that hearing voices wasn't normal. And I have always heard voices, and I thought like everybody did hear voices. I thought that was a thing that people had, and I was like, oh shit. And I already had people had talked to me, and they thought I had DID. They're parents of students in high school, and it just kind of clicked. Like I had already been evaluated, and people thought I had schizophrenia because of different things I was trying to get help with, and I just sort of clicked that I have DID. So then because I'm autistic, there's like a thing where you focus, you get like a hyper focus on information. So I just read about 200 books in a couple months, like book after book after book after book after book. Because I was also working at suicide prevention, doing in the overnight shift, so I had a lot of free time to just read, and figured it out. And then going into my practicum, I immediately started getting clients because it's a place where there was access for people who didn't have a lot of money and were struggling. And so, of course, you're going to get people with DID who are going to show up. And I could clock them right away and start to help that. But I did have trouble getting supervision or consultation for that because of my clinical supervisors they didn't know what the hell I was working with. They were more used to basic stuff. And I mean, not that it's not common and not basic.
They didn't
What's
understand
that?
dissociative identity disorder.
At all. Not at all. And so then I got outside supervision. Took a class with Stephen Frankel, and I just started connecting with people who work with it in the community so I could make sure I'm doing the work ethically and as well informed as I can. Yeah. Hmm.
But frankly, he's quite a beacon for dissociative identity disorder.
Yes. Yeah.
And why do you think our society has been reluctant to embrace dissociative identity disorder?
Uh, well, that's a big question. I mean, it's trauma, right? So I think it's a couple things. I think one is that it's trauma. So we have people who have DID, then you have to accept that people are doing horrific things to little kids, and we so often don't want to say that that's common or normal, and unfortunately it is. I mean, with my work with trafficked young girls and my work just in general in mental health, it's it's stupidly common. I would love to be wrong, but it's just not been my experience. And we need to fix things, but we don't. Um, it would cost money, it would cost empathy, it would cost community, things we're not that invested in, because I think we just want to have people in jobs making other things and pushing money around, rather than really fix this. That's kind of a quick and dirty answer. The other thing I think that scares people with DID specifically is that I think most people are, I think we're all wired to have DID or plurality. I don't think it comes out of nowhere. I mean, I think that we lean into it when we're young and we're violated because it's a way to help us cope. But it isn't magical. Like, think of anything that our body does when there's stress on it. It does what it does already. It just does it more in weirder ways. So the concept that maybe we can have different selves that have different feelings and different even allergies, or when I work with autistic folks who have DID, they're different selves. They're all autistic, but they'll present autism in a variety of different ways. Some might have different sensory issues, or some might have different empathy abilities, or some might have different abilities to visualize. The concept that our self as we know it probably isn't a single stable self is probably very terrifying to many people.
Now, I believe DID is primarily environmental,
Yes.
but with autism, is have you seen a heavy duty genetic component to that, or is
Yeah.
that
Oh, sorry. That's my ADHD. I don't mean to interrupt people. It just happened. So I'll apologize for that. It's accidental. Um, yes, it is. It is genetic. My mom seemed to have autism. If I look at my dad, he spent an entire vacation with a speak and spell I had, trying to learn every single word that the speak and spell knew, which is not something somebody who doesn't have autism would normally be interested in. Um, and and this is a little controversial, there are even like facial characteristics that happen with autism, and how like because I'm an artist, so I look at that, like the space between the nose, the space between the eye and the cheek, and then the way the head is. And I've seen like family portraits of relatives way far back, and like you can kind of see that characteristic that people have pointed out. Um,
a phrenology component? I mean, I'm
yeah,
phrenology kind of.
yeah. Well, like, yeah, just because there's also like other things that correlate, like autistic people tend to have more sensitivity to medications than non-autistic people. There's a higher correlation with what's called Danlos syndrome, EDS, or hyperflexibility. Um, like I can do a lot of flexible things without warming up. It's also got a downside though, because like people will have things like ribs will just pop out of place, or things will pop out of joint, and it's a problem. Um, there are other components. There's actually been studies, it's funny, and people have talked about this, that autistic people seem to age slower because there's issues with collagen. So there's studies on like why that occurs. You can look it up and you'll see a bunch of studies on why aging is slower. And some of it's sort of like, well, they act younger and that's why they look younger. But some are like, actually, the collagen is different. It's just different. So it's not just neurological. It's kind of a whole body thing, which makes sense. I mean, why would it just be in the brain? It's kind of ridiculous.
So I've had one hip replacement, and I'm going to get a second one. Does that mean my girlfriend was wrong when she said you're on the spectrum?
But spectrum means like not like little or a lot. It means what different kinds of colors plug into how you are made.
Uh-huh.
And so not everybody is made exactly the same. It's not like, oh, you have a little autism and you have a lot of autism. It's just like what kind of things plug into your autism. And so if you have a hip replacement, it actually might mean that you do have more collagen issues because your hip was so flexible. Maybe it caused it to have a breakdown. Or
Actually, I took a pretty bad fall in the Rocky Mountains
Mhm.
10 years ago. And I think that kind of where I took, I mean, it was a hard fall onto a very hard surface. So I think that might have started it. It's difficult to know with that type of stuff, but I don't see it in my family. So I'm surmising that it's somewhat environmental.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you're gonna fall. It's gonna have injuries. I have a back injury from a fall. You don't bounce back from that. It has impacts.
So we encountered each other on this ritual abuse mind control study.
Yes.
And what experience do you have working with those two types?
Yeah, I have a lot of experience, and I've been getting more. Once started my practicum, I started getting clients that were in that zone. Like I said, I was trying to just get supervision to kind of help with the basics of DID, and so I didn't have. It's like there's DID, and then there's Ramcoa stuff. Like it's almost like a whole other beast on top of what you know about DID. So I was just trying to wrap my brain around how do I work effectively with DID with all of the limitations that I had. I didn't have any pathways at all for how do I work with DID that's non-organically created. And so I regret some of the work that I did. I think I did okay work, but I could have done much better work, than I did. But I just started getting clients. Like I think a lot of clinicians seem to have one or two folks that have this, and I, for whatever reason, have a lot. Like I'll take clients and I'll think that this particular person has bipolar, and then they turn out to have DID, and then later it turns out that it's non-organic.
How-
Um,
I mean, is that just through that person talking and eventually a different part emerges? Or,
Well, sometimes, I mean, what happens is I started to look for patterns and I try to track patterns. And that's gotten better as I've learned about things over time. Currently, what I do initially to kind of do a little bit of a scope out, which I didn't know at all to do when I was starting out, is I'll look at their inner world. And most, not all, but most JD folks have an inner world, and it can look wildly different. And if it's pretty peaceful and everybody seems to be getting along in there, I don't suspect that it's non-organic, or I don't suspect Ramcoa. But if there's a lot of hostility, and especially if there's hierarchies, or there just feels like if there's systems within systems, like if you have a inside person and then they have their own set of inside people, that tends to not happen very commonly in non-organic DID. So I just track these things, and I try to track it really early on, but I'm not going to present it to them. And I'm also just kind of exploring, and I could be wrong. I'm always open to being wrong. Like that's fine for me. And then when I start to get more information and more information, it starts to tumble. So, like, if I start to see that there's complications and there are areas where if I do this thing, everybody's like, no, if you do that thing, it's going to set off something akin to a tripwire and things are going to blow up. Um, that doesn't happen in organic DID. And then I start to look for the things that I see in non-organic DID, because there tends to be more of a pattern that matches. And so I'm looking at like, okay, so now I know this is there. So is this also there? Are there bosses above bosses? Are there separate systems that are doing different things? Are there informers? Are people who have jobs? Non-organic DID doesn't tend to have a lot of jobs. The kids are just there in the system. But when you have very structural, purposeful DID, there are jobs. I mean, they didn't pick those; they got assigned them.
And your approach, do you use a certain psychotherapeutic approach, or is there another other things that have worked better for you than outside of standard therapeutic approaches?
I use a grab bag of things. I don't really have a specific model. I've learned different models. I've tried things. I've thrown them out. I learned brain spotting, and that didn't seem to really help very much. I know people do use EMDR, and brain spotting is adjacent to EMDR. And I had heard it was better for neurodivergent folks. That's why I learned it. And I've just, what I've mostly used is, it's not even hypnosis because I was doing it already. It's that kind of creative on the fly, like this is this thing, and there is a kid, and let's see what we can do to dial whatever stressful thing is happening for that kid down inside, however we can. And so I use a lot of things that just come to my mind rather quickly. I do use a lot of consultation because that's helpful because this stuff is overwhelming. And so I consult with Lynette Danilchuk and I consult with Will Randall, and they've been enormously helpful. Probably much more helpful than like if I took a class and anything. So I get to kind of bounce things off of them back and forth. But I do use a lot of gut stuff too. This will probably sound a little bit weird, but it's not. There's been studies on this as well. Having had my own trauma history, there's like a I don't know. I think probably when things are really unbearable, you use every sense that you can possibly do to get out of a bad situation. So a lot of us have a little bit more of a sixth sense, and because it's like, well, we can't run and we can't hide and we can't fight. So what if we just intuit our way out? And so I use a little bit of like that gut sense. Like I'll kind of pick up on things quickly. And I'm getting better at that because I used to ignore some of that data, but I've been folding it in a little bit more and quickly and just checking it out gently to see if I'm on track or not on track so I don't follow a false lead. But but mostly just kind of I have a sense of where things are going. I have a sense that this is what's happening. And then there's sort of a rhythm that they and I get into where they're like, oh, this person gets it. This person actually sees all of the crap that happened to me and isn't telling me I'm making it up. And once we click into that, then their parts start to show up and they're like, here I am. Here's what happened. This is what's going on with me. And they want to be seen and they want to be known. So they start to interface with me in ways that I think a lot of other therapists weren't ready for or wouldn't be able to receive. And then we start to work with how to dial down their distress. And that's mostly what I do is dial down the distress inside.
I know someone who is certainly a victim of trafficking and is definitely DID, and we've become pretty good friends. And I suggested that he see a therapist. He was having some difficulties in his life, and I suggested that he see a therapist. And he wanted me to talk to the therapist, and I talked to the therapist, and I said, "This person is DID. I mean, he has had a lot of trauma very, very young, and I'm convinced that he's DID. And I have, I'm not an expert in this area, but I certainly know what I'm talking about sometimes. And she could not. I mean, she wasn't advanced enough where she could see it, and that really disappointed me because I was really hoping that he could be helped by this therapist, and but she didn't. She was confronted with his DID and just completely punted.
I'm sorry. It's unfortunately rather common and depressing.
And most people that are DID are seen by other therapists before they're actually a number of therapists before they're actually diagnosed.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the average is around 6 or 7 years before they get diagnosed. Most of my folks have, I mean, as you've probably seen too, diagnoses of all kinds of things, bipolar, schizophrenia, variety of different kinds of psychotic disorders, schizoaffective. And I mean, when I've been working in community mental health, that's why I sort of wanted to create, I was trying to create, and it got kind of, ISSTD started to take it up in their public health group, but it hasn't really gone anywhere in 4 years. So I'm going to try to move it with a different group I'm working with. But I would go in and do trainings around DID for these beginning therapists. Like, here's what it looks like. Here's how it is. This is what you can do, just as basic steps. And because the turnover is so high, they would move out and it would be erased. And I really, because there's so many people in these severe mental illness, community mental health organizations that have it or are being missed. And then they get diagnosed as having schizophrenia because every time there's voice hearing or anytime there's even like something odd, it doesn't even have to be voice hearing. I had one client who was assaulted and complained about feeling like she's walking around as a corpse. And they're like, oh, it's schizophrenia. I'm like, absolutely not. I mean, if it is, it's fine, but it's not good to just that. I call it the psychiatrist or the clinician's I don't know box. If they don't know what it is, they call it schizophrenia, and it's not helpful, and it hasn't helped people, and it's not good. And even if it is schizophrenia, the main treatment that they give is medication. And I've done some pretty successful treatment with people who have psychosis by doing actual psychotherapy, and that's not taught. I'm sorry, that's a little bit of a tangent, but
So we're talking about non psychosis, which are
yeah, when it's stress, like I've had people who have gone into jail and then get put into solitary because you can get put into solitary just because you're annoying. And solitary is brutal, right? And they've come out wildly psychotic when I saw them come in not psychotic at all. It's been pretty depressing.
I wrote a book called The Franklin Scandal about an interstate trafficking network. And there was one girl who refused to recant her abuse. The FBI came in and got most of the kids to recant, but she refused. And she was in solitary for 2 years.
Oh, wow.
And she's an unbelievable person. I started a organization called Epstein Justice, and she's one of the associate directors of Epstein Justice. So, and how a 20-year-old kid can withstand 2 years of solitary is pretty mind, and then come out intact. I mean, it's pretty mind boggling.
Impressive. Yeah. Because I think the people I worked with were not in as long as that when they fragmented. So I wonder what she did to kind of keep herself together.
I think that she refound her faith,
Hmm.
and I think that that gave her the strength. She drifted away from her faith, and her faith had been a really integral part of her childhood until her early teenage years. And I think that's what saved her is going back to her faith.
Yeah. I mean, whatever you can hold on to, because I mean, think about it being, it's when I started to learn about jail and prisons and how we treat in America, even like people think, oh, it's bad in other countries, but it's really bad in America. I I don't know how anybody keeps it together in there.
So you have a background of trauma. Is that difficult? I mean, you would, which would give you insights into trauma, but is that difficult for you to cheat? Has it ever been like a difficult task to treat trauma because of your own trauma?
Mm, I don't know because I've never not had trauma, so I don't know how it is for people who don't have trauma to work with it. I seem to have an ability to take on a lot more, for better or worse, and I don't know if this is great, but I have ability to take on a lot more than a lot of other people who don't have the level of trauma I've experienced. Um, I think one of my therapists called it the I have a high tolerance for intolerable situations. So I think that gives me a little bit more of a well to manage hearing about really awful things, whereas clinicians I have worked with or supervised who haven't had a trauma history that much, they can't handle hearing about it. I think that's sort of what we were talking about with the DID. Like, it's new news to them that things can be this bad. So when they find out things can be this bad, they have a very big visceral pushback on it. And I already know things can be that bad. It's not a shock for me. So I've had that wall eroded. I can kind of go there. That's not a problem for me. I do have to hold a lot of newer clinicians' hands who don't have that experience and kind of like, yeah, actually stuff can get pretty dark there. Um, what I also do, which I've talked with a few other clinicians, we started a group called the Refractory Think Tank, and we have about 80 to 90 clinicians with lived experience with OSDD and DID. We're kind of collaborating to see what we do differently as clinicians who have this, and we primarily mostly work with this. A lot of us talk about being able to kind of fold back different selves in a way that's helpful for our client work. So if we have selves that might be triggered by something our clients will present, we can kind of pop those aspects a little bit more back and have something more forward that's going to be more helpful. I think we have a little bit higher rates of compartmentalization for some of the stuff. Um, and not everybody has this, but these are just the clinicians. I mean, I suppose if you're doing clinical work and you lasted and you didn't kind of pop out, that you have these skill sets. Um, but sometimes things that my clients have will ping off of stuff that I've experienced, and actually, it's helpful for both of us. I think you've probably heard about clinicians who talk about having clients where they have some mutuality and experience, and they'll grow, and the client grows, and that is part of the deepening of work. Yalom talks about this. So with DID work, I think it's the same. There are clients that I have where some of their stuff really pops off of my stuff, and what I kind of do is I take the experience it triggers in me, and I was talking to my consultant recently about. I just kind of hang it up to the side. Like, I'll go back to that later, and I'll kind of keep going forward with them. But I'm deepening some of the things that I'm working on myself, and then somehow that gets woven back into my work with them, and it's kind of a unique and special thing.
A lot of the early psychoanalytic thinkers
Mhm,
had been sexually abused
mhm.
or abused, and I think that it gives them insight. I mean, some of them went crazy, like Wilhelm Reich, or I mean, Freud was a little crazy too.
This
But
this is stuff, yeah.
it's kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, where one alcoholic knows how another alcoholic feels.
Mhm.
So therefore, that alcoholic can help this other alcoholic in a way that someone who's not an alcoholic cannot help them.
I think that's true. I mean, obviously, it's not a perfect match, and you always have to have the humility that it's not you're not going to have the same experience. But I do. I used to never disclose with my clients, and more my clients have clocked me. And then since I've been out, I've been doing more public talks on it. I've just been like, I'm just out. Uh, I've had clients cry with relief because I have the same disorder that they do, because I'm not going to look at them as if they have three heads, or they're this like a unique thing or a test subject. Like, we're just kind of in it together. We're kind of the same animal, um, and that this brings them a lot of relief.
So you come across complex examples of mind control.
Yes.
Could you give us some insight into that?
Where to start? I've had some folks. I've had different folks who have different things, because there's different groups. I think they kind of collaborate with each other some way in some form, but they're still different from each other. They're trying to use the kid in different ways. Um, I've had kids who are kind of used to, well, and then now they're adults when they're working with me to try to make them into like a bunch of things, like an assassin and a honeypot and you know, a this or a that. I've had some that are just mostly used for one thing. I'm not sure if I know which direction to go with your question. I guess I want to ask for a little more help with that.
Um, you're more complex patients with mind control, where the mind control is obviously put in by people that are somewhat effective at it.
Uh-huh.
And
Oh,
are those the toughest patients that you have to deal with?
actually not. It should be. It should be my toughest patients. Frankly, my toughest patients are the ones who don't even have DID at all. And those are the ones I'm like, oh, I have this session coming up and I'm not sure what we're going to do here. Um, when there's DID, and especially for some reason when there's more complex mind control, I'm like, oh, we have a map. We're gonna do this and this and this and this and this, and I feel pretty. I wouldn't say at ease because it's brutal work, but I feel more confident. Um, and maybe that's a little bit because of my own background. Um, but what I do is like they show up, and I'm aware that they have a lot of complexity inside. Like there's a bunch of different kids trapped and scenarios that are repeating and hierarchies and different kids or people who are kids but don't think that they're kids are they're acting as aggressors. And I just kind of keep track of them all. And I try to figure out how I can get to each one as it feels useful. I don't tend to map things on paper when I map out systems. I do tend to, and that's probably an autistic skill, just kind of keep the map in my head. And and I'll check with them, like, do you want to go in this direction or do you want to go in that direction? And sometimes a whole new direction will just pop out. Um, so, so I'm trying to keep track of where kids need to get soothed, what kids haven't been talked to, what kids think that they're adults and are doing maybe abusive tactics, and how to kind of calm them down and to make sure that everybody knows that I'm not here to get rid of anybody, because that's sort of a fear. It's like a lot of therapists who don't know anything about this kind of work, when they start to encounter some of the more aggressive selves, like, well, we'll just chuck them, we'll just wall them off, and that's never a good idea. You want to kind of collaborate and connect with them. I've learned, I think, through Will Randall around like reading stories and having some stories on tape, if that's not a trigger for the particular client with their history, can help have some of the kids that think that they're abusive adults start to want to be kids again. You're just kind of softening them a little bit and a little bit. It's like you can't undo the whole system really fast because there's so many things you don't know and there's so many things going on all at once. I often think about it like a bunch of plates spinning. So you're trying to slow the plates so nothing breaks a little bit at a time so that you can grab each plate before it falls and cracks. And if you make a mistake, I've also learned that with Lynette Danilchuk, is that it's actually information for the system. Like there was a time I like went in and barreled in because I didn't really know what was happening. And I tried to speed up what I thought was a flashback to get the kid to the end of the flashback and pull them out. But it caused a bad, awful explosion in the system of a ricochet of horrific things. So I was able to kind of reverse it and put it back together. And that wasn't ideal, but like the system learns, like, oh, you can actually make mistakes and you can actually put it back and it's not terrible. And so having that experience of learning and doing things and moving in different ways and being able to kind of have flexibility go back and forth is not something they've ever experienced before. So it really is helpful for them, frankly. Um,
So you're looking at creating a working system rather than integration.
yeah, I mean, if they want to integrate, that's totally fine. what I mostly do with a lot of these complex systems is I'm trying to get them to see me and have me see them in a way that feels meaningful, and then slow things down, um, because everything seems to be going so fast and so intensely. So I want to have space so we can look at what's happening inside and see what's actually happening. Like if there's a self injury memory that kind of goes over and over again, can we slow it down so we can look at what is the knife? Is the knife a real knife? Is it look the same the entire time? Does it have a texture? And in that way, we can go, oh, that's actually a memory of something you had happen to a kid. It's not a random, you're crazy, you want to hurt yourself loop. It's like somebody taught you to do that. And somebody taught you to do that with a real thing you can hold. And then once we start to slow that down and look at it, then it starts to lose power.
And you also work with transitional aged youth.
Yeah, I used to run programs for that.
Can
I
you,
think that's actually been really helpful for my work with this population as well. Go ahead.
could you give us like a definition of transitional aged youth?
Yeah, I can go really nerdily into it, but I can give a quick summary as well. Transitional age youth is often called emerging adults more worldwide. It is roughly the age range changes. I kind of define it as around 18 to 25-year-olds because services and things change and supports change once a kid hits 18 and they lose a bunch of stuff. Um, and then when they're 25, it's not like perfect, but the prefrontal cortex generally has finished growing at that time, and it may or may not entirely be like on spot, but so there's a lot of things that a person has access to that they didn't before then. But some groups will range it from like 13 to 30, and I think that's not useful. It's too wide. It doesn't help. But I have noticed specific clinical things that work well when I zero into 18, like younger 18 to 21, and then 21 to 25. That helps. And a lot of people don't have patience for that population because they find them annoying. I find them really fun, and I thoroughly enjoy working with them. I like when they're snotty and they're just doing whatever. And sometimes we go out and play games, or when I would do a lot of community mental health work, we would even go shopping together and do a lot of things that aren't necessarily conventional in the you're meeting in the room for 50-minute hour therapy. They don't necessarily always connect with that kind of work real well, which is why I think it's been generally considered that they're not workable with DID and we should wait until they're older. But that's not the case. I think that it's because the clinicians just don't know how to connect with them that they drop out of therapy and they don't find them workable.
I look like a well-adjusted white boy now, but I was a juvenile delinquent back in my youth,
Good for you.
and I was sent to some therapists, and I quickly concluded that they were full of shit and listen to anything they had to say. Now they might have been reasonable. I just didn't think that at that time, from where I was coming from.
You're probably correct. They're probably full of shit. Yeah.
So you've got gender issues in
Yes.
in this group, and what type of gender issues do you have to deal with?
Um, a lot, especially with autistic populations. There's a whole concept called gender. I don't know if you've heard about that. So gender issues are more common with neurodivergent individuals because they don't perceive their gender in the same way as regular as typical people do. So it's really common for me to work with people who are both autistic and gender expansive or transgendered and also DID. I could go into a whole side pocket around DID and gender, but I won't do that. I'll keep to the topic. Um, but but a lot of youth are, questioning their gender. Some of it is just like stereotypical gender norms are really rigid, and I think a lot of people are breaking those sort of standards. Sorry, I'm going to take a cough drop because I'm still going to start to cough. I've been getting over a cold. Um, Here, just a second. Hopefully that'll nip that in the bud. There you go.
Looking very graceful, I should say. No, I'm serious. I mean, as far as like graceful, so you don't have to worry about that.
Okay. But I work with a bunch of youth that I did a talk recently on like youth who are, you can either not identify with the gender that you're assigned with at birth, or just a second, sorry, I'm really trying to get rid of this raspy thing. Um okay. Um or you can fully feel like you're the opposite gender, depending. And some of the folks I work with are also intersex, like maybe they don't have reactivity to estrogen or testosterone in their body, which can create a bunch of impacts on the brain and the neurosystem, as you can imagine. Um, but if we think about the brain and we think about the body, just external sex characteristics don't necessarily make up what is a man or a woman. There's a lot of hormones that can occur in utero, and as your body creates them uniquely, because everybody's got a little bit of a unique, there's like a normal, but a lot of us deviate, frankly. I think probably more of us deviate than would fit like the absolute norm. So in that way, a lot of us probably are a little more intersex than we would like to admit. We don't have studies for how, we don't often study how hormonal balance works for folks, or even like people have been surprised around their chromosomes. They haven't gotten tested because why would they? And then suddenly, as an adult, maybe for some medical reason, it pops up that they have chromosomes that don't match the XX or the XY. So a lot of people don't necessarily feel, that I work with, that they are strictly male or strictly female. They might feel like they're non-binary in between, especially if they're a DID system, because there's a lot of mixing of female cells and male cells. And one of the things that I've noticed in my DID clinical work is there's been a big push for folks to integrate fully and fuse before they want to sign off on gender affirmative care. But the experience of living with a confused system without access is its own trauma, which I don't think a lot of these clinicians, if they're cis, are taking into account. But the other thing is that why would we expect everybody to blend and be like suddenly a cis male and a cis female if you've got a bunch of self states who are male and female and in between? Like, if you're asking for a blend means that they're blending all their states, which means they're probably going to be somewhere non-binary somehow. Although I have met some people who are DID and have leaned entirely one way or the other, even trans.
I have a friend whose grandson
Hmm.
starting to get hormones, and he is at this point, I think he's 13, and um, and my friend was fairly cool with it. But I was thinking to myself, when I was young, I mean, when I was a teenager, I thought Sigmund Freud was right. So you know,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, so
A lot of people who are 50 think Sigmund Freud is right.
so I was wondering, how should that wait till like at least someone's like 18 years old to
Yeah,
um
I mean, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not gonna like weigh into exactly what's right. Normally, what happens, that's why I was surprised at 13 and getting hormones. Although been some really interesting studies around this. Normally, what happens is you'll do like hormone blockers, so that gives a pause, and then around close to 18, you'll start more invasive, like, well, hormones, actual hormones. I know some people are not happy about hormone blockers, but they've been really well tested. Like people go into early puberty, and that's a normal thing that we do with kids to stop it because it's really hard if you're 6 years old and your body's starting to do that. Um, so usually what happens is that there's like a pause, and then around 17 to 18 is when they start to kind of do more of that gender affirmative care. There's usually social gender affirmative care before that, where you get to dress as you would want to and present as you would want to and have the name. It is complicated at 13. I don't know this kid and I don't know their doctors, so I mean, I do kind of like think maybe they shouldn't have done the hormones quite yet, but there must. I'm hoping there was a good reason. I know some people have done it and have regretted it. It's a very very small percentage over the studies that have been coming out for the last, I don't know, dozen years have shown overall there's very little regret or problem when kids who feel that they're the opposite gender than they're assigned at birth start to access gender affirmative care. It decreases bullying, it decreases suicidality, it decreases self harm, it decreases dissociation. That's something that happens as well. So, and the studies that I saw, which is pretty impressive because this isn't normal for any study, there was a 0% regret or problem. Like they got the affirmative care and everybody was in the study and they did a longitudinal study, felt that it was helpful and useful. So,
And last but not least, tell us about the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence.
what would you like to know about us?
Just go for it.
Okay.
Pretend that you're talking to someone who has never heard of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence.
Sure, which is something I do quite a bit. So I am part of the San Francisco branch of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. My sister name, we all have pun names, is Sister Frida Desire. Um, we started in 1979 in San Francisco. There were a bunch of individuals at that point. One is still involved in the sisters, whom I'm friends with. Sister Vicious Power Hungry Bitch is her name. But she goes by Sister Vishnu now. She's toned it down. She's gotten older. Um,
A little
but
going.
being gay in 79 and being gay now is a very different thing. So having more pushback and more anger was needed to survive. So they borrowed some nuns' costumes from some actual nuns. They were going to do the Sound of Music, they said to the nuns. They never ended up doing the Sound of Music and they never gave the nuns habits back. But they walked around San Francisco, and because gay people had been so pushed out of churches, there was such an intense reaction to seeing men in nuns costumes, and so they continued to do it. That happened on Easter, which is why we have an annual tradition of celebrating ourselves on Easter, which upset some people, but that's specifically why. um then the AIDS crisis hit and the churches were really really not interested in helping us. They were just letting us die. And the Catholic Church and different other Christian churches,
And the United States government.
and the United States government, yeah, Ronald Reagan, we were putting pressure on him as well, and they were just letting us die. And so there was a hunger for this, the rituals of religion, because it's comforting for people and people are scared. So we ended up doing that. We ended up doing like, confessions, but we would just be there to help people just say what they had off their on their chest and off their mind. We washed the dead. We did burials. We would sit with people as they were dying and do that sort of death doula thing because churches just weren't interested. We raised money. We started our fundraising campaign then to try. It was called Gay Cancer at that time, so we did the first fundraiser for gay cancer, and then we just kind of kept on, and it's like religion without the religion. And we also kind of have a lot of irreverence, which somehow upset some people. but we are worldwide now. So we have houses in Australia and England. There was one that was going to start in South Africa. We had one in Ukraine, but it got disbanded because it got too dangerous there. We have one in Uruguay, and we some of them are really really small, and some of them like in San Francisco we have 100 or so of us here. So we raise money and we give it away to organizations like nonprofits and sometimes small artist groups if they're doing things for the community. So we in San Francisco we raise somewhere between 60 to 80,000 a year to give away, and we give away it twice a year, and it ranges from 200 to 2,000 depending on how much money we have. Most of our budget is what we raise money and we give it away, and we're really transparent about it. And we do all sorts of causes now. It's not just queer causes. We do causes for like people. Paws are wonderful. Pets are wonderful support that we give elderly people pets to have. We raise money for cancer programs. We raise money for homeless. We go and give. We go and do projects where we give items away for people who are living outside so they can be safer. And I don't know. We just do. We just we got really visible with the whole Dodgers thing recently. Probably I don't know if you heard about that.
I did.
Yeah.
I got a kick out of it. The sister, I want my audience to remember this: the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Katie,
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate you having me on. And
I really appreciate the interview, and I'm sure that we will interact at some point in the future.
I'm almost certain since we're both on the one list. And
And have yourself a great night.
you too.